Okay, cool. So we'll make a start, everyone, because I used to be a math teacher like all of you, and I know how much you guys appreciate brevity and being concise and having things done on time. So I promise this will be super tight. So thanks for coming, everyone, especially on a Tuesday afternoon. I really appreciate it, and the team at Mathspace really appreciate it. Like I said before, it looks like in the chat we've got teachers from all across the country, which is amazing. It's not all the time we get, all tee up together to, as a kind of a community across Australia as maths teachers. So super grateful for you guys turning up. Like I said, I'm going to keep this tight. We've got 30 minutes, and I want to make sure that every one of them is super useful. Now, I've tried to build this session around ideas that are useful regardless of whatever tools you're using in your classroom. So perhaps that's Mathspace or some other digital platform, or even no, maybe it's just a classic pen and paper classroom. The research I'm going to share with you is a lot of what shapes the philosophy behind what we build at Mathspace in terms of new features and tools with the goal of supporting you, the classroom teacher. But it's also shaped how I thought about my own teaching long before I joined Mathspace. So let's get into it. So, like I said, whether your school is a one-to-one device or a pen and paper school, the underlying question is the same either way. How do we design practice environments that actually build durable skill? Now, technology might change the way we deliver things, and like you would imagine, a lot of you teachers went through COVID. We could see what happened there. But the psychology behind actually building the skill is the same. So wherever you're at with devices, stay with me. I think you will find this presentation useful. All right, so if you were here with us for our last webinar on space practice, welcome back. And for those that weren't, here's just a quick piece of context that will frame a lot of the stuff I'm going to cover today. Now, my colleague Alex introduced in his previous webinar the Ebbinghaus Forgetting Curve, and Ebbinghaus mapped this in the 1880s, so a long, long time ago, and it's become one of the most replicated findings in cognitive science. But basically what it shows is this. So without active retrieval, we roughly forget 50 to 70% of new material within 24 hours, and within a week, that can reach up to 90%. This is why the experience I'm going to describe is so common. So you've got a student doing all the work, completing all the tasks, or most of the tasks, and engaging with the material. The scores look solid when you're just doing that formative assessment, but then a few weeks later, you come back to the concept and it seems as though they've drawn a blank. Now, I can definitely tell you from my own experience as a teacher and visiting a lot of schools and talking to a lot of teachers, it seems to be super common. This is the scenario that happens all the time. We go to teach, let's say, three topics, A, B, and C, in preparation for an assessment task. And we'll usually teach that in a linear fashion. So topic A, topic B, topic C, and then have a revision. But a lot of the times, by the time we get to the revision, we find that instead of revising topic A and B again, we end up really reteaching topic A and B almost from scratch, and sometimes even C, depending on the lesson. Now, the forgetting curve explains what happens. The knowledge was there briefly, but it wasn't actually locked in. And so the question is this, what does it actually take to lock in? And so if you've joined us last time, we talked about the idea of space practice as the antidote. So returning to materials at different intervals, as you've seen in the previous graph here. So you kind of buck that curve. But today we're going to go one level deeper. And it's not about just when you revisit material, it's about how you revisit the material. So the question I want to explore today is this. What does it actually mean, or what does it truly mean to actually know something in maths? And so I'm going to share with you three pieces of research that I found super useful, and they've fundamentally changed how I think about teaching and learning. Now, I've tested them in my own life, and when I mention research, personally, I'm a big fan of studying high and elite level performers and people who actually try these approaches themselves in their own life. Excuse me. So I think this is especially important when it comes to learning research because many of these concepts are really tried and tested by real people and not just in a lab. And so by the end of this session, I want to give you just a simple mental model with two parts. So something you can use to evaluate any practice environment, whether it's digital or not, and then decide whether it's building the skill you think it is for your students. Okay, so the first piece of research that really caught my attention was something around what is called the illusion of competence. And this is what it describes. Well, so when a student is working on a problem and they get stuck, whether they click on a hint in Mathspace or they peek at the work solution in the textbook, or they perhaps get a nudge from you, the classroom teacher, or even their classmate, something very interesting happens in the brain. So they read the hint and they think, all right, that's it. And then they go and continue to solve the problem. But it's in that moment the brain does something very human. It retroactively rewrites what just happened. It tells them, I knew that. I just needed a reminder. And the student actually believes they understood it. But here's a critical difference between recognition and recall. The brain did something, what the brain did was actually just pattern match against something it had seen. And it's a completely different cognitive process to retrieving something independently from long-term memory. So two people I've read describe this in striking detail. The first is Josh Waitzkin, and he was actually a childhood chess prodigy, later turned Tai Chi world champion. And if anyone's seen the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, the movie is about him. But in his book, The Art of Learning, Waitzkin tells us that when he was growing up, he found that many of the young chess players start by learning opening moves. And so that makes sense. You learn the opening moves where there are traps and they can force early wins. So a player who knows them beats unprepared opponents easily. Now, people who learn this way often excel at first, but what they're building is a library of positions they actually recognize. Now, Waitzkin's teacher took the opposite approach. So he spent hundreds of hours in the end game, so basically the phase of the game where the board is nearly empty, where there's far fewer pieces and less noise. And the goal wasn't to memorize what to do, but it was actually to understand why and how the pieces interacted. Now, studying these less complex board states makes it easier to recall how each piece moves and help him to learn a deeper understanding and deeper principles behind the game. And as games got harder, other kids struggled while Waitzkin grew stronger. And because his expertise was built from the foundation up, he had an advantage when the board was wild and chaotic. Now, he hadn't just built a library full of positions he'd recognized, he'd built a library of principles he really understood. Now, the second is Scott Young, who we'll meet properly in a moment. And his book, Ultra Learning, side note, is my favorite all-time book on anything learning and skill acquisition. So I can definitely recommend that. But he makes this observation. He says that rereading, the thing that almost every student defaults to when they're studying, creates a measurable illusion of competence. So students who reread their notes feel significantly more confident than students who test themselves. But on actual assessments, the rereaders perform worse. Now, the feeling of knowing is genuine from the student, but the knowledge itself isn't there. And so Young points to a body of cognitive science behind this, and we'll come back to the actual paper when we get to the section called match simulation. Now, side note or side story, I was literally doing some tutoring on the weekend, helping a student in year 12 prepare for his trials, which we have here in New South Wales. And he said almost verbatim, he said, I'd been doing some of the harder questions in the past papers, and I would get stuck towards the end. But then I would look at the work solutions, and from there, I know what I should have done. Now, this is the danger of the illusion of competence. He doesn't actually know what he thinks he does. And critically, it's not just a digital problem. It applies equally if the hint is just from a work solution, or it's from a teacher walking over and giving some prompting, or perhaps just a classmate. So as you can see here, this is the framework that maps this. It's called the 4 stages of competence. So stage 1 is unconscious incompetence. The student has just watched you model, for example, solving a quadratic equation. So they might be nodding along, feeling good, copying things down. There's no alarm bells, but they haven't tried it alone yet. Now, stage 2 is conscious incompetence. So that's when perhaps they open the textbook to attempt the problem set that you have set them, but they can't really remember what's what. They don't know which one is the coefficient for the sum or which one is for the product. So it's uncomfortable, but they actually know. But here's actually the most useful thing in their moment of learning. The feeling of being stuck in the brain tells them what they should be focusing on. Now, stage 3 is conscious competence. So it's the same student, same problem, and now they're working it through deliberately. So perhaps they might be writing out pairs, for example, that multiply to give negative 72, but add to give 71. And perhaps they're going through each one and checking. They get there eventually, but every step takes effort. Now, unconscious competence is, I imagine, everyone on this call now. Glance at the problem and the structure is already obvious. So there's no deliberate search. the factors just appear. That's mastery. So here's the problem with hints or prompts. A student gets a hint, looks at the work solution, and their brain files it at stage 3 or 4. They say to themselves, I understood that, but they never really hit stage 2 and the stuck moment. They skip the signal that tells them whether the knowledge is actually theirs. So this is why removing the scaffold at the right moment isn't just about raising the difficulty. It's about giving students an accurate read on where they really are. And once we can see clearly, the question becomes, how do we calibrate the challenge to meet them there? And that's the second piece of research. So the second bit of research comes from a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Yeah, I definitely practiced that many times before this presentation. But his book Flow was a book that I'd found during the first COVID lockdown, and it really has stuck with me ever since. So the author spent decades studying what he called flow, which is the state of deep, almost effortless engagement when you're really absorbed in a task. So athletes call this being in the zone, and his core finding was this. Flow only happens when the challenge of the task precisely matches the current skill level. So if it's too easy, the student drifts into autopilot. So now they're doing the task, but not really there. And if it's too hard, they hit anxiety and shut down. Now, I'm sure you've probably seen both of these today in your classroom. But here's the part that really struck me. The flow zone isn't a fixed place. It moves. So as a student builds skill, the same task that once produced flow becomes too easy, becomes stale. And if we don't keep raising the challenge to meet their growing ability, we're not actually helping them improve. We're just keeping them comfortable. Now, in the pen and paper classroom, you manage this always intuitively. So you might have multiple levels of the same worksheet. If you're using Mathspace, you might be assigning custom tasks, which you have edited yourself by choosing different questions from different stages in New South Wales, for example, or different year levels. But the question is the same. How do we consistently and systematically do this across an entire class every day? Now, the third piece brings together the few researchers and practitioners who arrived at the same conclusion, but at opposite directions. So the first is Anders Ericsson, who studied many elite performers, which included chess grandmasters, concert pianists, and elite surgeons. Now, his finding wasn't that they had necessarily more talent, and it wasn't just that they had put more hours in. It was the quality of practice. So he called it deliberate practice. And that's when the practice targets specific weaknesses, where it operates at the edge of their current ability and relies heavily on a coach or second half to that equation. So once the skill is built with a coach, the safety net needs to come off. And so that brings in Scott Young, who we mentioned before. Now, Scott actually completed the entire MIT 4-year computer science program just in 12 months as a self-directed learner. And this was just a challenge that he had posed himself. But one of the things he talks about is this idea of directness. And it's the idea that practice must resemble performance as closely as possible. Now, most learners violate this constantly. They read about maths instead of doing maths. They do exam questions with the solutions side by side, and they practice in conditions far more forgiving than the conditions they will actually be tested in. And I actually think this is one of the reasons why a lot of our students do the assessment task, and they will come away from those assessment tasks, many of them saying it was nothing like the work we did in lessons. Now, I'm sure that will sound very familiar with you. But back to Young for a second. So he discovered on his MIT challenge that when he was reading lecture notes and watching the videos, he felt like he was learning. Then when he started actually doing the problem sets under these exam conditions, so no notes, no hints, and working to a time limit, he realized just how much of his studying had been an illusion. Now, the principle of directness asserts this. It's actually while doing the thing you want to get good at is where much of the learning takes place. So Josh Waitzkin, who we met earlier in the context of the illusion of competence, well, he calls this the investment in loss. And so when transitioning as a chess prodigy to a martial arts champion, he would regularly spar more skilled fighters. Not to practice losing, but to get comfortable operating under pressure without rescue from a coach. If you only practice in conditions where you're likely to succeed, you build that surface level confidence, not real resilience. And so you have to be willing to lose to actually improve. Now, I'm sure most of you already tell your students this, especially when their marks are not as how they had hoped in their assessment tasks. There's always learning to be found. But for also our students, it means this. At some point, the scaffolding needs to come off deliberately, regularly, and by design. So not to be harsh, but because that's where the skill acquisition occurs. Okay, so here's the synthesis from those three ideas, and I just want to get there through a story of my own, and this is outside the classroom. So as a millennial, your quarter life crisis usually manifests as some sort of physical hobby. So it's either usually a run club, Pilates, high rocks, or some sort of martial art. And for me, it was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But jokes aside, one of the things that really struck me when I first started is this. Everyone gets better. So almost without exception, and at surprising similar rates, beginners who showed up at the same time, regardless of their athletic background, their size, or whatever natural ability, we all seem to improve at roughly the same curve. So I thought to myself, why is this happening? Why is everyone improving so much in the same time period? What is it about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that produces such consistent improvement across such different people? And this is not something that we actually see in the maths classroom. So the answer is actually built into the structure of every single class in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Every session ends with what we call rolling, which is ostensibly just live sparring against a resisting partner. So not drilling a technique where your partner cooperates, but actual sparring where nothing is given and where you have to figure out under pressure in real time. So drilling is the training ground and rolling is match simulation. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, both happen every single session by design. Now, let's think about the math classroom for a second. If I had to estimate the split, I'd say it's something like 98% drilling, 2% match simulation. And most of that 2% is usually like the final exam or the assessment. So we build skill all year and then spar maybe 4 times a year, being those assessment tasks. Now that's the equivalent of going to a martial arts gym where the students drill for 12 months and then enter a competition with barely any sparring experience. Now, why is the parallel to learning maths and learning martial arts so fitting? It's because both disciplines are fundamentally processes of skill acquisition. So learning things conceptually, internalizing them, and then applying them in practice. Now, the research says you need both in deliberate rotation throughout the year, and the training ground is where the skill is built, but the math simulation is where it's tested and consolidated and any weaknesses exposed. So both, neither replaces the other, but both are just as important. They work together, and the best classrooms do both deliberately. So let me show you what it might look like. So here's the training ground first, and this is, the playbook that we're all familiar with as maths teachers. So we might introduce a new concept, perhaps we draw some real-world application, we walk through the worked examples while our students are copying them down, and then they attempt a question set, perhaps a worksheet, textbook exercise, or even something in Mathspace. Now, while they're working, they're referring back to your examples, they're asking for help, or they're using Mathspace and accessing Milo AI, for example, or rewinding a video example to attempt to reverse engineer the process. That's the training ground, and it's not wrong, it's essential, but it has a blind spot. So students practicing with support doesn't tell you what they can actually do without it, which is exactly what the illusion of competence described. So keep that in mind as we move to the next environment. Now, the second environment is what I call match simulation. And I want to say something directly. You've been doing this for years, and I'm sure perhaps you've even done it this week. It's every time you hand out a silent task or you tell students to work independently without their notes, that's match simulation. And one thing I want to be clear is it doesn't have to look like a formal assessment every time. In fact, when it's not high pressure and when it's low stakes, is usually better. So you think of it as frequent retrieval, because the research is actually clear on this point when it's low stakes. Students engage more honestly, they don't panic, and you're going to get the most accurate picture of what they know. Now, the idea isn't new. You can see here, Francis Bacon wrote this in 1620. He said, if you read a piece of text through 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you had read it 10 times while attempting to recite it from time to time. Now, earlier we talked about Scott Young, who pointed us towards this research. And this paper by Rodiger and Karpik, studied in 2006, is actually one of the most cited papers in cognitive psychology. And so Here are the numbers. They basically put two groups through, one where they reread their notes, one that tested themselves. And after 5 minutes of studying, the rereading had actually outperformed the testing group. But after the 1 week mark, the results flipped. Testing group retained 56% and the reading group only retained 42%. But perhaps the most interesting finding about all of this was it was the studiers that actually felt more confident about how they'd performed. And I quote this from the paper. Students may prefer repeated studying because it produces rapid short-term gains, even though it is an ineffective strategy for long-term retention. Now, the framing matters too, as I mentioned before. When students understand that the environment where the coach steps back, and that's actually by design, not because you're being tough, they approach the discomfort differently. It becomes the investment in loss that Waitzkin describes. Now, here's the practical challenge that comes along with doing this well. For match simulation to have a real impact, the research says it needs to happen frequently and multiple times per unit, not just as a summative assessment at the end. The forgetting curve we saw at the start flattens when you hit the material with retrieval, not just once. But doing this on paper means writing a new quiz, marking it, tracking who got what wrong multiple times per unit. And that can be extremely time consuming on top of everything else you're already doing. You can absolutely do it. You can absolutely do it. And I'm sure some of you already do, but it comes at a real cost. Now in Mathspace test mode, we remove that friction entirely. There's no hints, there's no worked examples, there's no videos, and there's no immediate green ticks. The student works independently exactly as they would in paper, and the moment they finish, the data is there waiting for you. So not just who got the right answer, but a full step-by-step breakdown of each student's reasoning and where it went off track. So as you can see in this example, the student in 4A had just transcribed the wrong numbers and they got it incorrect. But in the following part in 4B, you can see that our testing engine has recognized that the student actually knows what they're doing in terms of finding the volume, but it also gives a feedback of that consequential marking in terms of what had happened in part A. So here's the payoff for you as the teacher. In any match simulation environment, pen and paper or digital, you get the most honest signal available, what your students can actually do without support. That's insightful data that a scaffolded practice will never get you. The difference between Mathspace test mode engine is the depth and speed of that feedback. So when your students complete a test mode session, our AI system marks every step of the working, and you can see, did my students set up the equation correctly? Did they lose a solution at the second line of algebra? Or did they demonstrate conceptual understanding but make a procedural error? And combined with this frequency point, you can run a 10-minute retrieval check multiple times per week at zero marking cost. So you're really giving your students far more repetitions against the forgetting curve, and that's the combination that makes the science actually work in practice. Okay, so let me land to where we started, almost there. The forgetting curve told us that learning fades without active retrieval, and the illusion of competence told us that our students, and honestly all of us, can't accurately tell the difference between recognizing something and actually knowing it. Flow told us that challenge has to keep pace with the skill, and Erickson, Young, and Waitzkin all said the same thing from different angles at some point. The safety net needs to come off. So the mental model I want to leave you with is simple. You've got two environments. One, the training ground, and that's where the skill is built with support, with feedback, and with a coach, you. And then there's match simulation, where the scaffolding needs to come off and the student finds out what they actually own. Most classrooms have the training ground. It's the match simulation that's missing. Or when it exists, it's happening only a couple times per term or even once per term as a high stakes exam rather than a regular low stakes practice. You don't need new research for this. You don't even need new tools. You just need both running in deliberate rotation throughout the year. Okay, so to close, I want to make an offer. It's just a 15-minute conversation. I'm calling the Maths Stack Audit. So whether you're using Mathspace, another program, or even just pen and paper, the audit is the same. We're going to look at how your department is currently balancing scaffolded practice with unscaffolded, independent recall, and I'll share what we've seen work and not work in schools with similar context to yours. So if you're interested in exploring Mathspace, we're happy to give you guys free access to run a test mode with your own classes next week. Of course, if you already are part of our Mathspace family, feel free to make use of that whenever you like, but that's optional. the conversation is useful either way. As you can see, the booking link is on the screen now. And I'll just come back to this. That's it, guys. Like, we'd love to hear any questions that you have. I'm honestly more curious about your experience and finding out if this resonates with you. But while that happens, I will pop the QR code back on the screen.
Thank you, Adrian. That was fantastic. I'll just leave it a minute for people to type if you do have any questions. I think there's some really valuable insights in there too, and particularly the approach to low stakes testing and reframing assessment for students. I think that's really important. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions, which is fantastic. So we can wrap it up there.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a lovely evening. And yeah, we'll put this up available for you to share or watch again. And then, yeah, I'd really encourage if you would pick up any resource, Ultra Learning by Scott Young, big game changer. So hopefully you can get some value out of that. But otherwise, take care and good night. Thank you, everyone.